This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. One of the greatest factors that motivated me to start this show was the fact that as I began seriously studying economics in 2020 and reading figures like Thomas Sowell first and then Murray Rothbard and finally Ludwig von Mises, who has become, in my opinion, the all-time greatest economist. All of the other Austrian school economists are fantastic, but he certainly represents the high watermark. I, at the same time, was reading a lot of biblical scholarship, and for several years at that point, I had been aware that most biblical scholars had never seriously reflected on economics or political philosophy, and I started this show to explore the reason why there was this gap in thinking among Christians in general, but biblical scholars and theologians in particular when it comes to economics and politics. Like, why is it that they make these very sweeping statements about the way that society ought to operate and about the way that our economic system should work, when it seems like they've never really engaged with those ideas? So on the third episode of my show, I took a scholar that I really love, Michael Gorman, and I criticized one aspect of his work. He was very I'm assuming still is, very prone to criticizing capitalism. But it was clear from reading his work that he didn't actually understand what capitalism meant. He was using it in the very casual way that people that have been sort of influenced by socialist-y, Marxist-y college professors use the term without lacking, and it lacked any precision at all. And so I took a look at one of Michael Gorman's books, and I compared his statements on capitalism to statements that were made by the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. And I entitled that episode, Ludwig von Mises versus a Christian Scholar, Round 1, Michael Gorman. And then later on in 2022, I did another one, Round 2, with James K.A. Smith, another scholar that I really like, who also says a lot of things about capitalism that have nothing to do with the way that professional economists, and in particular the Austrian school, actually define capitalism. And I just broke down some of his statements, compared them to the work of Ludwig von Mises, and determined that his criticism of capitalism was actually not a criticism of capitalism, but of certain aspects of socialism. And again, with both of these scholars, the goal was not to put them down, or, I mean, obviously these guys have PhDs. They're way smarter than I am, and they've been teaching for a long time, and I really value this work. It's not me trying to punch up at these people at all. It's that I have seen within the discipline of biblical studies and theology an acute lack of nuanced economic thinking, and I wanted to, even if it's just for my audience, at least start a conversation about how we can learn to think better about economics in those disciplines. And do I think that I'm ever going to make a real impact? I have no idea. But it was a fun series, and I promised in 2022 that I would make the Ludwig von Mises versus a Christian Scholar a regular part of my show. And lo and behold, a year and several months after I released that episode, I'm finally getting around to round 3. So I'm really excited about this one. I actually began doing prep work for the episode back in the spring of 2023, and then just lost track of it with all the books that I've been reading and all of the authors that I was interviewing. So we are in the middle of a 5-day extended snowstorm period. So I've been off work for a little bit because we've had all these snow days. So I figured I'd finally get around to doing this. So guys, this is going to be episode 3, round 3 of Ludwig von Mises versus a Christian Scholar. And this time I'm taking on the big dog himself, N.T. Wright. Now, I know that if you listen to this show, you're probably familiar with N.T. Wright. I think that it's safe to say that he is the world's most famous biblical scholar. And when I was in college in 2007 through 2012 and working on my degree in biblical studies, N.T. Wright was kind of at like the height of his popularity. I think actually he published Paul and the Faithfulness of God a couple of years after that, and that was really when he peaked. But it was pretty obvious in the 2000s that N.T. N.T. Wright was like the guy in New Testament scholarship. He was all over the place. Everyone wanted to read his books. And I think that especially within evangelical circles, he's still probably the world's most famous biblical scholar today. And of course, he's famous for promoting the new perspective on Paul, which in many ways I find convincing, and in many ways I don't. But I think that his work has been very stimulating, and he's raised a lot of good questions that other scholars have in some ways answered better than him. He's also well known for the Christian Origins and the Questions of God series. I've read every book in that series so far, all 4 of them. And I was really steeped in N.T. Wright because he was just so popular at the time that I was in college. And it was very apparent to me when I started reading his work that he was an excellent writer and a deep thinker, and I really appreciated a lot of his work. And he very much shaped my understanding of the Bible and theology. But like with most scholarship, as time went on, it became more and more obvious that there were some flaws in his work. And as I have grown older and matured, I've really distanced myself from his approach to several aspects of Paul. I still think that his book, Jesus and the Victory of God, is kind of the best sort of third quest analysis of the historical Jesus. And he's really good on like ecclesiology in Paul. He's pretty good on apocalyptic. I think that he got like justification not 100% correct. There's a lot of stuff that N.T. Wright does that I find a lot of value in, and then there's a lot of stuff where I think that he just doesn't do a very good job. And I really do feel like he is, of all of the biblical scholars that I read, prone to kind of these massive overgeneralizations. So again, I want to give respect where respect is due. He's had a tremendous impact on promoting these ideas that before N.T. Wright were really only in the circles of professional biblical scholars. Now people in the pews of these churches have access to these ideas, and he has a lot to do with that. And again, I really appreciate his work on Jesus, more critical of his work on Paul. But I want to make sure that at the outset of this episode, I'm giving him the respect that he deserves, because he is a very well-learned and influential scholar, and there is a lot that he says that I agree with. He's also responsible for, in some ways, my journey to libertarianism. N.T. Wright was at the forefront of the anti-imperial reading of Paul, and I believe that he published his article, Paul's Gospel and Caesar's Empire, or something like that, in the early 2000s. And that was like the first work on Paul and Empire that I ever read. And I agreed at the time with everything that he said in that article. And then I started reading Richard Horsley and Neil Elliott and all of these guys who were very much promoting the anti-imperial reading of Paul. And for those of you guys that have been following my show over the last year or so, you'll realize that my views on Paul and Empire have definitely changed. But it was in the late 2000s that I began thinking, in early 20-teens, that I began thinking for the first time about how my faith impacted the way that I understood economics and politics. And I very quickly came to the conclusion that if the Bible is anti-imperial, then I should try to separate myself from the empire, regardless of whether a Republican was in charge or regardless of whether a Democrat was in charge. I did not think that I should be involved in the empire at all. And even though at that time I might still refer to Jesus as like a socialist because he believed in charity, I didn't understand the definition of capitalist and socialist. I really started believing that the church and not maybe the government was responsible for providing charity, and that maybe the church should keep the state at arm's length. Now, N.T. Wright's approach to Paul and Empire, which I believe that he still holds, has been very, I think, effectively challenged by scholars like Najib Haddad and Clint Burnett, both of whom I've had on the show, that talk about how, in reality, Paul does not make the Roman imperial order front and center in his thinking, but they kind of relegate it to a side issue. And for Najib Haddad in particular, he says that for Paul, the Roman imperial order is not good, but it's just a part of the old creation that will eventually be done away with. But even if N.T. Wright's wrong, there's no other way of reading Paul than to say that for him, he at least marginalizes the Roman Empire. The church should be separate from the Roman imperial order. And in the New Testament, we have books like Revelation, which is explicitly anti-imperial. Like, you cannot get around the fact that Revelation is in a direct conflict with the imperial order, and that should shape the way that we understand politics and economics. And another aspect of N.T. Wright's work, besides the Paul and Empire stuff, that really affected me in my thinking on politics and economics is his very good work on ecclesiology. Even though I might disagree with the way that he nuances justification and salvation and some important terms like that, I think he gets a lot right, but I also think that he gets some wrong there. I still think that fundamentally he is correct in saying that for Paul, the church is everyone, Jew and Gentile, that puts their faith in Jesus, the Son of David. And when they put their faith in Jesus, they're given the Holy Spirit and they're incorporated into the family of Abraham, the family of Israel. And so Israel in the New Testament era has the exact same responsibility that they had in the Old Testament era, that is to be a light or a witness to the nations. But there are hard boundaries between the people of God and the nations, and we should try to maintain those boundaries. We shouldn't blur the boundaries by trying to identify ourselves with the imperial order. And so if you take this view that I had, that Paul was critical of the Roman Empire, and then also this view that came from N.T. Wright's work of this robust ecclesiology, which again comes out of the fact that he's a Reformed scholar and that the church should be in many ways distinct from the world, then I think it very, very easily leads you to something that approximates libertarianism. That if we're going to translate those ancient ideas into the language of modern political and economic thought, libertarianism is the most accurate representation of that way of doing theology and that way of reading the Bible in its historical context. And both of those were very much influenced by reading N.T. Wright. But the irony for me, and in 2016, when I discovered libertarianism as a philosophy, was that N.T. Wright sets himself up to almost grasp the truth about the way that his biblical worldview should shape his perspective on modern politics and economics, and he just misses it. He just gets it wrong. And he, like many of his comments about other theological issues that I find important, I think that N.T. Wright's so close to being right, but he just doesn't quite get it. My own Gospels professor, John Weatherly, great guy, PhD, I think he's teaching at Johnson University in Tennessee right now, but when I had him in Gospels class, he made the exact same point about N.T. Wright. He very much like me, like Jesus and the Victory of God, and was influenced by Tom Wright's reading of JVG, but he said that when it came to Tom Wright's political application of his reading of Jesus and Paul, that N.T. Wright got almost everything wrong, and I happen to agree with John Weatherly's statement on that. Again, N.T. Wright, I'm not talking down to him. He's a great, great scholar, much smarter than me, much more talented, much more accomplished, and much more successful, but there is an obvious lacuna between his theology that he derives from his historical reading of the Bible and the way that he believes that should be played out in the modern world by Christians, the way that should inform how the church thinks about politics. And a lot of this is because, like most biblical scholars, I don't think that N.T. Wright has ever seriously studied economics or alternative political philosophies other than the ones that are commonly taught at universities. So this is all to set up today. What we are going to be doing is I critique N.T. Wright's perspective on economics. And we're going to do this in two different parts. The first part is I'm going to read a passage from a book that was published a couple of years ago called History and Eschatology, that was based on a series of lectures that N.T. Wright gave in, I believe, 2018. So it's relatively recent for N.T. Wright. And he has a kind of explanation of the impact of Adam Smith and the natural hand of the markets, which is in reality a veiled critique of capitalism. Now, N.T. Wright, and this is one of the things that is both brilliant and frustrating about his work, is that when he starts talking about the practical applications of the theological conclusions that he derives from his reading of the Bible, he's always extremely vague and general. He is always very careful to not use specific trigger words that are polarizing or that will make people angry. It's brilliant from a marketing perspective, but it's very frustrating because he doesn't ever seem to take a hard stand on very important issues. He always leaves these statements about how to apply his theology in the modern world open and somewhat cryptic. But as we go through this short passage in this book, History and Eschatology, it's going to be pretty obvious that what he's doing here is a veiled critique of what scholars like Michael Gorman and James K.A. Smith would just openly claim to be capitalism. So here's what N.T. Wright says, and this comes from This comes from his book, History and Eschatology, and this is very important, talking about Adam Smith. He says, third, there was the radical economic theory of Adam Smith, who in 1776 published The Wealth of Nations. Here we have to be careful because a recent study of Smith argues strongly that the great Scotsman was not advocating the full-on, laissez-faire view of economics with which he has subsequently been associated. A wide-ranging polymath, Smith wrote about many topics other than economics, and the famous metaphor of the invisible hand appears only 3 times in his entire work and only once in The Wealth of Nations. Nevertheless, his ideas have ever since been taken up in the direction of a self-driven self-interest that would automatically guide the flow of money to bring about social improvement, or at least wealth and harmony, which many will have thought would amount to the same thing. Again, this is exactly what Michael Gorman and James K.A. Smith would associate with capitalism. N.T. Wright goes on. Even though Thomas Hobbes did not, as people sometimes suppose, describe the human community as a world full of wolves, his undoubted pessimism forms a stark contrast here to Smith's optimism. Analyzing Smith's complex proposals is way beyond our present task. Like others of the time, he was eclectic and held together elements of Stoic, Epicurean, and Platonic thought. But the mood of the time seems to have swept him along with it. The way he was read in the 18th century and ever since amounted to a proposal that, like Newton's mechanistic universe translated into money, the clock would work by itself. This has become highly influential in subsequent economics, being used to justify unfettered industrial expansion within the spreading imperial worlds, and ending up with the greed is good philosophy of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Anyone that knows Austrian economics understands that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are not the capitalists that they were cracked up to be, and also that the moment that you talk about imperialism, you're invalidating the very foundation of capitalism. We'll get there in a minute, where I'm not Mises here. No allowance needed to them to be made for such radical ideas as organizing care for the poor, let alone the remission of large debts, the Jubilee principle. Smith himself, strung on the side of the poor, would have been horrified, but he has been read in accordance with the larger cultural movement. Now, again, we can automatically see here that this is kind of like the freshman in college level of economic critique of capitalism. Now, most people would have maybe guts aren't the right word. No, I think most people would have the guts to just straight up say that Adam Smith has been read as reinforcing these capitalist ideas, and we don't like capitalism because it's evil and it promotes greed and all of these kind of things. N.T. Wright doesn't do that, but you know what he's talking about in this passage. And again, he goes on to say that capitalism undergirds imperialism, that it informed Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, that capitalism isn't concerned about the poor, and that capitalism believes that somehow kind of magically or metaphysically the markets will just kind of work, which is actually a Marxist idea and not a capitalist idea. And I'm sure that N.T. Wright's thinking economics has been much more influenced, if subtly, by Marxism than it has been by pure capitalism. And so this is just frustrating because this is just another example of a New Testament scholar that fails to define the basic terms that we know he's trying to articulate in this book. He would immediately associate this with capitalism, or I think that he would if he had the if he'd had the mind to do that. But it's just not the case that his reading of Adam Smith and the reception of Adam Smith amounts to capitalism, because that's not what capitalism is. Now, maybe I'm mistaken and N.T. Wright does actually know what capitalism is, and this is a veiled critique of socialism, but given his context and given other statements that he's made, I doubt that is the case. Now, I think that this is going to be a good opportunity to read a sort of longish section from Ludwig von Mises's epic Human Action. This is his 900-page treatise on economics. This is kind of the standard textbook for Austrian economics, and it explains absolutely everything that anyone would want to know about praxeological economics. And I think that the logic is irrefutable, and it makes sense of the data that we receive from the world around us. And I have gone over the definition of capitalism and socialism on this show many, many times. Capitalism is a system in which all of the factors of production are privately owned and economic decision-making is decentralized, and socialism is the exact opposite. It is a system in which the factors of production are publicly owned or publicly regulated, and all economic decisions are centralized or made through planning boards. So the problem with N.T. Wright's critique of the reception of Adam Smith and the implicit critique of capitalism that's buried underneath it is that it fails to understand that basic distinction. And you saw that in the phrase that he included in that paragraph about the market driving imperialism and about the market kind of being the force behind the policies that were imposed by Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. We know as good Austrians that any government involvement in the market, including imperialism, is antithetical to capitalism as understood by the Austrian school. Because by its very definition, if you need an army to go and conquer a land to get a resource to produce a product, that is not an example of the factors of production being privately owned or the factors of production being or decisions about the factors of production being made by decentralized parties. It's exactly the opposite. In fact, what N.T. Wright is describing in that passage is socialism. Now, Ludwig von Mises, and I've referenced this before, in chapter 15 of the Great Human Action, has a very, very long description of the market and how the market actually works. And by the market, he means capitalism. And again, I don't feel like an Austrian that I have to define the term capitalism in the same way that the Marxists do. And I think that it would be really, really good as a counter to what N.T. Wright says here to actually listen to the way in which Ludwig von Mises describes the capitalist market in Human Action, because we will immediately see that based on that passage I read out of History and Eschatology, N.T. Wright does not understand these very basic economic concepts. He's getting these terms, these ideas confused. He doesn't understand the way that markets actually work in a free economy. And so I'm going to read a longer section of Human Action here, but it's brilliant and it's absolutely essential for understanding why N.T. Wright gets this wrong and why Ludwig von Mises is the optimal corrective for his failed attempt to explain the impact of market economics on the Western world from the time of Adam Smith on. So here's what Ludwig von Mises says in a section entitled "The Characteristics of the Market Economy." He says, the market economy is the social system of the division of labor under private ownership of the means of production. Everybody acts on his own behalf, but everyone's actions aim at the satisfaction of other people's needs as well as the satisfaction of his own. Everybody in acting serves his fellow citizens. Everybody, on the other hand, is served by his fellow citizens. Everybody is both a means and an end in himself, an ultimate end for himself, and a means to other people in their endeavors to attain their own ends. Again, this is a point that Mises makes over and over in his work, that the only way in a free market economy without a government interfering in the factors of production, interfering in economic decision making, the only way that you can become wealthy is by doing one thing and one thing alone, and that is producing a good or service that other people want to buy on the open market that actually benefits those people. So it's very, very important to understand that under free market capitalism, you can, and only under free market capitalism, do you have the conditions under which people can be truly altruistic towards each other, producing goods that benefit other people, and the income that are based on those goods will benefit the person who is producing them. That's the way that a free market system with respect of property rights works. He goes on, this system is steered by the market. The market directs the individual's activities into those channels in which he best serves the wants of his fellow men. There is the operation of the market, no compulsion or coercion. The state, the social apparatus of coercion and compulsion, does not interfere with the market and with the citizens' activities directed by the market. It employs its power to beat people into submission solely for the prevention of actions destructive to the preservation and the smooth operation of the market economy. It protects the individual's life, health, and property against violent or fraudulent aggression on the part of the domestic gangsters and external foes. Again, if there's going to be a government in a market economy, their job is to protect private enterprise, to protect contract, not to breach it. He goes on, thus the state creates and preserves the environment in which the market economy can safely operate. The Marxist slogan, anarchic production, pertinently characterizes this social structure as an economic system which is not directed by a dictator, a production czar who assigns to each a task and compels him to obey the command. Each man is free, nobody is subject to a despot. Of his own accord, the individual integrates himself into the cooperative system. The market directs him and reveals to him in what way he can best promote his own welfare as well as that of other people. The market is supreme. The market alone puts the whole social system in order and provides it with sense and meaning. And this, the statement that Ludwig von Mises is going to make here undercuts what N.T. Wright says about the market operating as kind of this suprahuman force. Here's what Mises says. The market is not a place, a thing, or a collective entity. The market is a process actuated by the interplay of the actions of the various individuals cooperating under the division of labor. The forces determining the continually changing state of the market are the value judgments of these individuals, and their actions is directed by these value judgments. The state of the market at any instant is the price structure, i.e. the totality of the exchange ratios is established by the interaction of those eager to buy and those eager to sell. There is nothing inhuman or mystical with regard to the market. The market process is entirely a result of human actions. Every market phenomenon can be traced back to a definite choice or two definite choices of the members of the market economy. The market process is the adjustment of the individual actions of the various members of the market society to the requirements of mutual cooperation. The market prices tell the producers what to produce, how to produce, and in what quantity. The market is the focal point to which the activities of the individuals converge. It is the center from which the activities of the individuals radiate. So again, the market, according to capitalists like Mises, is not this suprahuman force that guides people to an ultimate destination. It is just a term we use to describe individuals acting to satisfy these market wants based on profit and loss, based on cost, based on supply and demand, based on scarcity and choice, all of these other basic economic concepts that we understand. The market is not a force in and of itself. It is just a description of individual human beings interacting and cooperating with one another. That's all that it is, and there's nothing in N.T. Wright's analysis that would suggest that Mises's definition of the market is the problem. In fact, every single problem that N.T. Wright identifies is a problem not of the free market, but of socialism, and this is exactly what Ludwig von Mises is going to say here, right, in this next passage. He says, the market economy must be strictly differentiated from the second thinkable, although not realizable system of social cooperation under the division of labor, the system of social or governmental ownership of the means of production. This second system is commonly called socialism, communism, planned economy, or state capitalism. The market economy or capitalism, as it is usually called, and the socialist economy preclude one another. There is no mixture of the two systems possible or thinkable. There is no such thing as a mixed economy, a system that would be in part capitalistic and in part socialistic. Production is directed either by the market, which is just individual actors cooperating and interacting, or by the decrees of a production czar or a committee of production czars. If within a society based on private ownership of the means of production, some of these means are publicly owned and operated, that is, owned and operated by the government or one of its agencies, this does not make for a mixed system which would combine socialism and capitalism. The fact that the state or municipalities own and operate some plants does not alter the characteristic features of the market economy. These publicly owned and operated enterprises are subject to the sovereignty of the market. They must fit themselves as buyers of raw materials, equipment, and labor, and as sellers of goods and services into the scheme of market economy. They are subject to the laws of the market and thereby depend on the consumers who may or may not patronize them. They must cover losses of its plants or shops by drawing on public funds. But this neither eliminates nor mitigates the supremacy of the market. It merely shifts it to another sector. For the means of covering the losses must be raised by the imposition of taxes. But this taxation, its effects on the market and influences the economic structure according to the laws of the market. It is the operation of the market and not the government collecting the taxes that decides upon whom the incidence of the taxes fall and how they affect production and consumption. Thus, the market, not a government bureau, determines the working of these publicly operated enterprises. Nothing that is in any way connected with the operation of a market is in the praxeological or economic sense to be called socialism. The notion of socialism, as conceived and defined by all socialists, implies the absence of a market for factors of production and of prices of such factors. The socialization of individual plants, shops, and farms, that is, their transfer from private into public ownerships, is a method of bringing about socialism by successive measures. It is a step on the way towards socialism, but not in itself socialism. Marx and the orthodox Marxians flatly deny the possibility of such a gradual approach to socialism. According to their doctrine, the evolution of capitalism will one day reach a point in which at one stroke capitalism is transformed into socialism. Government-operated enterprises in the Russian Soviet economy are, by the mere fact that they buy and sell on markets, connected with the capitalist system. They themselves bear witness to this connection by calculating in terms of money. They thus utilize the intellectual methods of the capitalist system that they fanatically condemn. For monetary economic calculation is the intellectual basis of the market economy. The task set to acting within any system of the division of labor cannot be achieved without economic calculation. The market economy calculates in terms of money prices. That it is capable of such calculation was instrumental in its evolution and conditions its present-day operation. The market economy is real because it can calculate. So again, the obvious conclusion that we must draw from this is that there is an antithesis between capitalism and socialism, and if it is not based on a purely free market, the free exchange of goods and services between individuals cooperating with each other, which we call the market, then it's not capitalism, it's socialism. And all of the problems that are associated with an unfree system should not be attributed to capitalism. And imperialism, political policies, anytime the government intervenes in the market, whether it's Ronald Reagan and his so-called trickle-down economics or Margaret Thatcher, none of these factors or politicians were capitalist in the Austrian sense of the term. And in fact, if you look at Ronald Reagan's actual record, he expanded government spending. Ronald Reagan, a little bit of a socialist. And I know that most New Testament scholars have never read Ludwig von Mises. I know that they've never really thought seriously about the fundamental definitions of these terms and how they ought to work in the real world. But I think it's very, very obvious that N.T. Wright's critique of capitalism in History and Eschatology is just wrong. All right, man. Again, it's always good to start with these fundamental definitions. I know that I talk about this so much, but I'm probably going to say it for the rest of my life because people need to understand that capitalism, as it's understood by people like me and probably most of you, my listeners, is not the caricature that it's made out to be in the academic world, in the media, in political circles. It's just not. And many of the figures and the policies that are attributed to capitalism are actually the result of socialist thinking. And this is one of the reasons why Ludwig von Mises' work is so brilliant and so simple, is he just breaks down the fundamental distinction between these two ways of looking at human interaction and cooperation. And I absolutely love this. Now, this is going to bring us to the second part of this episode. There was an interview that N.T. Wright did a couple of years ago with a guy named Phil Chen. Now, this interview was broken up into two parts and put on YouTube. I took a couple of clips from them, and I'm actually going to be playing some of these clips in a minute so you can hear N.T. Wright talking about these issues in his own terms. And I have, and I will put the links to the videos so you can watch the full videos on YouTube if you want, so you can see I'm not taking them out of context here. But Phil Chen, the guy that interviews him, they talk about money and some other economic issues. And Chen is like a self-described entrepreneur. I don't know anything about him, but he does seem to be very positive about Bitcoin. And at several points in the interview, and I listened to the full, both of these full interviews or both halves of this one full interview, he seems to be kind of positive about markets as well. And he's talking to N.T. Wright about money. Now, one of the things that it's very easy to see, and you'll get this, I think, from the clips that we're going to play, is that N.T. Wright has a very surface level understanding of economics. And a lot of the responses that he gives to Phil Chen, you can tell that N.T. Wright is out of his element, that he's trying to work his way through or feel his way through to an answer to these questions based on his principles without having any sort of coherent or overarching economic thinking. So he's not thinking in terms of objective economic definitions like we're trying to do on this show. He's trying to work his way to these answers. And like I already said before, N.T. Wright is going to get really close to being correct about a lot of the answers to these questions that he's given, but he just doesn't quite get there, which again only affirms my theory that some of the most brilliant New Testament scholars in the entire world just need to spend some time reading actual economic literature that's somewhat outside of the mainstream. There's a whole great world out there other than what they tell us to think about economics in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I really hope that some New Testament scholars will actually take me up on this and read Mises, because it definitely would have helped N.T. Wright here if he would have at least understood that there were other ways of thinking about economics than the ones that were popular in his circle. Again, he's very close, but just misses. Now, the very first clip that I'm going to play here is where N.T. Wright's talking about the 2008 financial crisis. And at this time, he was the Bishop of Durham in England, which means that he had a seat in the House of Lords, which is the upper chamber of England's parliament. And they had debates about what to do about the financial crisis. So he's talking about that, the financial crisis, and he's going to blame it on laissez-faire economics, right? And so we've already seen that based on N.T. Wright's passage in History and Eschatology, that he doesn't really understand the consequences of free market or laissez-faire economics. He says that free markets are the problem, or he implies that free markets are the problem, but he doesn't actually give us a definition of it. And the examples that he gives are all examples of government intervention in the market. So this is a very interesting clip. I'm going to play this clip real quick, and then we're going to break it down. So here is N.T. Wright on the 2008 financial crisis and the free market.
I was Bishop of Durham from 2003 to 2010, which meant I was in the House of Lords in London. Not that I could get there more than 2 or 3 times a month, but that's how the system works. And I found myself in a debate in the House of Lords on what to do now that the crash had happened. And it was fascinating. There were about, 30 or 40 speakers, and all of them, except me, were worried about how to put the system back together again, because, oh dear, it's not going to work. I was the only one who pointed out that the people who were really suffering as a result of all this were the poorest of the poor. Sure. I lived at that time in a small town in West County Durham in the northeast of England, and I watched as shops and banks on the high street were shutting down, were being boarded up, and people would walk down their high street and maybe 2/3 of the premises were all boarded up. And I would then go to London and see that, London had bounced back. This is no problem. It was a little blip, but we got over it. And I had a strong sense then that an awful lot of people in power were really ignoring what was going on for the people who were already poor and for whom this crash was making things worse. Quite suddenly in 2008, the banks themselves ran out of cash. That's right. And they flew in their private jets to Washington or London to say, oh dear, we've run out of money, please can we have a handout, or please can we have our debts remitted. And what I said last night in my lecture, which I've said many times, is the very rich did for the very rich what they'd refused to do for the very poor. Right. Now, I'm not an economist, but it's actually common sense to say something is wrong with that picture. Now, what precisely is wrong and what precisely should be done about it I know it's a very difficult question. There's not an easy answer to that. But I think we can't simply, especially from a Christian point of view, we can't simply look at that and say, oh, well, that's the way the world is, never mind. We'll let the bankers go on paying themselves vast bonuses, and too bad if all the shops in Bishop Auckland shut down. It'll all even out. That sort of laissez-faire system, I think Jesus would have pretty sharp words for it. Sure.
Okay, so for those of us that are familiar with the Austrian business cycle theory, the Austrian trade cycle theory, we understand that pretty much everything that N.T. Wright said there is exactly as I described it before. He's so close to understanding the truth, and he just misses it. Now, I would highly encourage those of you that don't understand what happened in 2008 to go and read Tom Wood's book Meltdown, which I think is the best analysis of the financial crash that is in print. It's phenomenal. He explains it using Austrian economics, and it makes sense. But there's nothing about what happened in 2008 that was a phenomenon of the free market, and the bailouts were not a phenomenon of the free market as well. It's really, really simple. The United States has a central bank and has had a central bank since 1913 that is responsible for creating money, for expanding the money supply, and for setting interest rates. So already the currency that we use in the United States for every transaction is being manipulated by an organization that was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson in 1913. So the Federal Reserve is a political, i.e. government organization that manipulates the market. According to Ludwig von Mises' definition of free markets, there is no place for government-backed central banking. And then in 1971, the American currency, which had at least been nominally pegged to gold, there was some actual physical backing to our fiat money. In 1971, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard and completely disconnected our dollar from any sort of hard backing. So our dollar became a pure fiat dollar. And the consequence of this is that between 1913 and 2024, the US dollar lost 97% of its purchasing power because it was being manipulated and expanded by the federal government. This is what central banks do. And the problem in 2008 is that the federal government had been printing money and had injected it into the economy. And because of the way in which the federal government had manipulated interest rates, this is the really important one because monetary expansion really didn't take off at the level that we see it today until after the crisis in 2008. But what the federal government did was that they artificially kept interest rates low, which meant that it was very easy for people to purchase a home. But then because they bought these homes that they couldn't actually afford only because the interest rates were low, a lot of people went underwater in their mortgages, and it completely wiped out the housing sector of the American economy, and a lot of sectors that were tied to it went down. And since the global economy is connected to the economy of the United States, the entire global market took this massive hit in 2008. And all of this had to do with central banking, artificially low interest rates, and then other ways that government encouraged people to purchase these home loans that they would not have been able to afford on the free market. That's the reality behind it. And the government was behind this from start to finish. So there was nothing laissez-faire about what happened in 2008. And Ludwig von Mises has a very short description of what is called the trade cycle or the business cycle in Austrian theory. And essentially the way that this works is that the business cycle, the cycle of boom and bust that we're all familiar with, where the economy takes off and then all of a sudden the economy crashes, is not really a purely market phenomenon. There would be periods where the economy would boom, and there would be periods of recession in the economy in a pure market economy as technology developed and as people had to reorient their purchasing and production decisions in order to meet these new market realities. But these massive booms and busts are actually caused by credit expansion and by printing money, all of which is facilitated by central banks. So during the boom period, the government keeps interest rates artificially low. The government prints additional money. That money and credit works its way through the economy. People begin to purchase things and invest in businesses that they would not have been able to otherwise afford, because that's the problem with artificially low interest rates and cheap credit, is that this incentivizes people to purchase that which they would not have been able to afford on their own. So it really incentivizes consumerism. It's a government form of incentivizing consumerism. So during this boom cycle, you have what is called malinvestment. People are purchasing all of these goods and services and investing in expanding production, but in the end, the market can't sustain it. Like eventually this money binge, this credit binge runs out, and people literally don't have the ability to fund all of these projects or continue to pay for that which they purchased. And in 2008, it happened to be housing. Government kept the interest rates artificially low on housing. People purchased houses, and they wound up being underwater in a mortgage because they could get the initial loan, but they couldn't pay it back. And so the bust happens when the market is actually trying trying to correct itself and get back to the fundamental market mechanics. That's the way that this boom-bust cycle actually works. And so the bust is actually the positive side of the boom-bust cycle, because it's kind of like the boom is kind of like when you get drunk, or you drink a lot of alcohol and you feel really, really good, and then you have a hangover the next day. That's the bust cycle. The hangover hurts really, really bad, but it's your body trying to recover from all the poison that you put into it the night before. And Ludwig von Mises has a very short passage in a small collection of essays that he gave, or a small collection of lectures that he gave, rather, called Money and Inflation, where he explains this. And he says this. It says, now, what is credit expansion? Credit expansion is inflation also. And I did an episode on inflation, which is just an increase in the money supply, about a year and a half ago. I'll throw that in the show notes if you want to listen to it. And he talks about credit expansion as a form of inflation, as a form of increasing the supply of money. He says, the reason for making a distinction between credit expansion and simple inflation is because of the different effects that an additional quantity of money has upon entering the economic system by the two different routes. In simple inflation, the new money enters by spending on the part of government. The government spends additional sums created, for instance, for the purpose of carrying on a war. The effect of this spending is that prices of the things the government buys goes up and consumers start to hoard. With credit expansion, the additional quantities of money enter the economic system, not through government spending, but through loans of newly created credit to businessmen by the banks. So the prices in the things businesses buy goes up. This brings about a boom in the business. If this boom is not stopped in time, it develops into a great economic crisis. This is the trade cycle, the most interesting phenomenon of the capitalistic system. And again, this is something that, as Ludwig von Mises is going to go on to say, in a natural system, people would realize that they malinvested, and there would not be the catastrophic bust that we see with artificially low interest rates and the expansion of money supply under the government. So all of this is to say that N.T. Wright is correct, that this really did hurt a lot of people, and that the bailouts really did benefit the rich. And it was a case of the rich doing for the rich what they needed to do to help themselves. But this wasn't a market phenomenon. This wasn't because of laissez-faire. This wasn't because of capitalism. This wasn't because of free markets. It was because of socialism. The entire thing was rigged by the government, and then when it failed, the government bailed out the people that took advantage of the initial rigging in the first place. And I agree with N.T. Wright. Jesus would have a lot to say about that, but he wouldn't be criticizing the free exchange of goods and services between individuals. Very, very important distinction. All right, let's go on. So the next clip I'm going to play for you, I want to break up into two parts, because Phil Chen has this really interesting introduction where he talks about how Bitcoin is kind of undoing traditional centralized currencies, and that it's not just a move away from the idea that currency should be manipulated by the hands of a central power, but it's a challenge to centralized power as it stands. It's not just about the money, it's also a challenge to the power. And he makes some really interesting points about that N.T. Wright will respond to in what I think is a pretty unimpressive way. So let's hear what Phil Chen has to say about Bitcoin.
And so Bitcoin, although started out as sort of a rebellion towards centralized money, it's now become a movement in terms of challenging centralized power as well.
Interesting.
Because now the power brokers are those that hold the data. Right. Because with data, you're able to predict. Right, they're the new prophets, so to speak.
Wow.
They're the new kings and the new prophets.
Yes.
Now, on the face of this, given the fact that, as I said at the beginning of the episode, N.T. Wright was one of the proponents of the anti-imperial reading of Paul, this seems like this would be a good development in the state of monetary affairs. And as I've made the argument before, and this is really what is central to the Austrian School of Economics, a lot of the problems that we're facing in the modern world today have to do with the fact that there is not a free market in money. We have these centralized currencies that are controlled, manipulated by a central bank in the interest of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the entire world. And the regulations are all really bad. That's 100% true. But unless we solve the monetary problem, we can never really fix a lot of the inequities, the structural inequities in our economy. And so what Phil Chen says in that clip, I think is absolutely right. Bitcoin has the potential to transfer power away from the elites to the average person. It could, and not just Bitcoin, but other decentralized currencies too, really do have the power, or really do have the ability to restructure the way that power is brokered in the modern world. And you would think that N.T. Wright, who in his writings at least seems to suggest that Paul is at least a little bit concerned about the exercise of centralized power, you would think that N.T. Wright would be able to get along with that. But his answer is actually not very good. Let's go ahead and see how N.T. Wright responds to Phil's explanation of Bitcoin here.
That's very interesting. And I mean, the whole idea then of transcending traditional countries, traditional regulatory schemes, traditional borders, I think we're all vaguely aware that that's going on, but that is going on at the same time as for instance, at the moment, there's a lot of talk, certainly in the British media, of a kind of a trade war between the US and China, or then, of course, all the Brexit issues and so on, which, in a sense, are old, traditional, rather grungy geopolitics. But that's going on at one level, with potential military and economic consequences. But then at this totally other level, all this stuff is happening, and I'm not sure even how the two relate.
Look, I really do appreciate the admission at the end of that clip where N.T. Wright says that he's not really sure how all of these ideas relate to one another. And I appreciate that there's a little bit of an air of humility when it comes to his response to Phil Chen's question. But we can see that it's almost completely incoherent. And there are a lot of things that I think that we need to understand about this. Again, this has been a major concern of Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises. And in fact, he writes extensively about this in Human Action and in other works, that these centralized currencies, these government regulations, these central controls over economic activity almost always lead to conflicts between nation states. In fact, it's the economic interest not of individuals, but of governments and of the people that are dependent upon government that lead to war and conflict between these nation states. And so this creates a lot of these problems that N.T. Wright would say he wants to solve. And again, I do feel like N.T. Wright here is a little bit stuck in this 19th century conception of nation states. He takes it as a given that we have to have all of these countries around the world with their own independent governments, with their own economic policies, and that these countries as collections of politicians have to figure out economic policies that will then affect all of the individual private citizens of their country. And I just don't think that that's the best or the most natural way to organize human civilization. And the Austrian school has also been very critical of that. These modern nation states that we have, this doesn't necessarily represent the best form of government that human beings can come up with. And the idea that something like Bitcoin or other decentralized currencies could transcend the modern nation state might actually be a good thing. Maybe the idea of the modern industrialized democracy is not the greatest idea about the organization of the human race. And again, as I said before, there is an abundance of evidence that many of the wars that we have engaged in have been fought over the economic interest of the politicians of particular countries. In fact, he even mentioned that in the passage out of History and Eschatology, where he talks about imperialism as an expression of the philosophy of Adam Smith. Again, of course, he gets this wrong because imperialism is, by its very definition, a project of the state. There's nothing free market about state projects like conquering other countries and extracting resources from them. And we also have to realize with this whole paradigm that we have been discussing today, that if we really want to create peace among the nations, then we have to allow individuals that live in each of these nations to freely purchase and trade and sell to one another. That's the way that we solve these problems. If people have their material needs met, they're not going to be willing to fight. And with decentralized currencies, with a challenge to the modern notion of the nation state, with taking away the power of the elites to manipulate the currency, regulate the economy, and get into wars with other countries based on the economic interest of the politicians, then we could solve a lot of these global economic problems that N.T. Wright seems to want to solve. Unfortunately, fundamentally, he just doesn't understand the way that this works. And as he admits in the conversation that he's having with Phil Chen, he doesn't see how those ideas could possibly hold together. But Ludwig von Mises, in his work, provides a very ready explanation for that. So it's really, really interesting. Now, as we move on here to the next clip, I got a couple more for you before we wrap up today. N.T. Wright is going to talk about the advantage of people living in these small communities and how in a developing and constantly changing world, people are often being dehumanized because of the advancements that he would, I think, attribute to capitalism. But as we're going to see in a minute, I think that this is an example of N.T. Wright coming so close to understanding the truth and just missing it. Here's what he has to say about small local communities.
I really do believe in real human communities, in smallish local communities. They say with mega churches that every Christian needs to belong to one group of roughly 70 people and another group of roughly 10 or a dozen people with whom they can be open and honest, with whom they can pray, with whom they can share fellowship and particularly share outward-facing projects for the good of their local communities. And it seems to me that whatever is happening on these other fronts, if we end up with non-communities that simply consist of lots of isolated individuals sitting in their own small rooms in front of a keyboard, then this is actually deeply dehumanizing. This is actually destructive of what it means to be human.
So for those of you that are familiar with Austrian economics, you can already see that he is addressing many of the concerns that the Austrian tradition has tried to explain. We need to live in small communities. What exactly is it that deteriorates or disintegrates or challenges the nature of these small local communities, people being able to organize and cooperate with one another? And Ludwig von Mises has a really great quote about human society from Human Action. It's a shorter one, and I'm going to read it real here. And he just is explaining what society is. And he says, society is concerted action, cooperation. Society is the outcome of conscious and purposeful behavior. This does not mean that individuals have concluded contracts by virtue of which they have founded human society. The actions which have brought about social cooperation and daily bring it about anew do not aim at anything else than cooperation and co-adjuvancy with others for the attainment of definite singular ends. The total complex of the mutual relations created by such concerted actions is called society. It substitutes collaboration for the at least conceivable isolation life of individuals. Society is division of labor and combination of labor, and his capacity as an acting animal, man becomes a social animal. So again, one of the most fundamental human behaviors that holds people together is free production and exchange. That's what creates communities. That's what creates these thriving local communities where people can voluntarily associate with each other and learn to live with each other. It creates peace and cooperation. And all of this is only possible under market conditions. And a lot of the concerns that N.T. Wright has that are rightly placed, all right, he is really worried about the undermining of local communities. Local communities are undermined by these large-scale government economic controls. We're hollowed out by our ability to save and make responsible purchasing decisions are completely destroyed by government inflationary policy, which devalues our currencies, and also by artificially low interest rates, which encourages people to make purchases that they wouldn't otherwise make in a state of market-adjusted interest rates. And then we also have these government controls and manipulations of the economy where they try to funnel people into certain sectors of the economy against the will of, or against the forces of supply and demand and scarcity and choice. And this hollows out local communities. And again, the idea that with a decentralized currency or with a free market and money, that people at the local level will be able to buy, sell, and trade in currencies that they see fit actually leads to more cooperation and stronger communities than having one currency imposed upon everybody by a government in a faraway place. The problem with having a world that is run and managed by a small handful of global elites is that they're only ever concerned about their own interest, and they will hollow out local communities in order to manage the world in the way that they see fit. And this is something that the Austrian tradition has always gotten correct, and it seems like N.T. Wright is completely unaware of those forces. And I'm sure that if someone actually pressed him on this, he would probably attribute the dehumanization of the degradation of local communities to something that he referred to as capitalism. But as we can see, it's all of these other non-market forces that are actually causing this to occur in the first place. He's got another section in this interview where he talks about local charity, and he talks about how there are many churches in England that have established lending services for poor people that need it, and that have also helped them get job training and other kinds of services like that, to which I say that's incredible because this is what the church should be doing. And so N.T. Wright here is going to talk about the need for local charity and about the power that local charity, especially charity that's directed through the church, has to transform the lives of people that are in need and strengthen communities. Let's take a listen because I think this is a really, really good point that he makes.
The churches have been doing this for quite some while, but I think he's developed schemes on this, doing local credit unions where within a local church community, a system will be set up to help the poorest of the poor to manage such money as they've got, and if they really don't have any to speak of, to help them find ways into, whether it's starting small businesses or whatever. And that's very much what you're saying about the local community, and I think it's a great thing for the church to be doing, helping people out of this monolithic structure which is crushing them.
Yes, I loved exactly what he said there. I think that that is so important. And it's amazing that there are churches that are out there coming up with these programs that actually help those in need. And I want to make the point that this is extremely consistent with his own ecclesiology and with his own anti-imperial reading of Paul. There are so many people like N.T. Wright that want to trust the government with these entitlement programs, but these large-scale entitlement programs have actually enshrined poverty. There have been generations and generations of people that are unable to escape poverty specifically because of these entitlement programs and the perverse incentives that they create. And so the church should be able to reject these large-scale entitlement programs and just help those people that are actually in need. Not only does this strengthen communities, which is consistent also with Paul's ecclesiology, the church is supposed to be the light to the nation, so really the church should be the ones that are providing these charities, but it's also consistent with his own anti-imperial reading. Why would people that are suspicious of empire trust these massive governments to have a monopoly on charity? It just doesn't make any sense. And so again, N.T. Wright is very, very close to the truth here. And this is exactly what Ludwig von Mises and the other Austrians would say. Charity is an absolutely essential component of human interactions, but it cannot be put in the hands of those with centralized power, and especially people that have the power to manipulate the money supply and interest rates at will. In fact, the artificial rigging of interest rates is one of the reasons why there are so many people that are poor, because they wind up making bad investment decisions and become underwater in debt. And so if we were able to get rid of that and then allow local churches to provide charity, then we would be in a much better position to help those that are in need. And I just hope that N.T. Wright can see at one point that there is a dramatic amount of overlap and consistency between the Austrian position and his own views on theology, specifically as it relates to the empire and the church. Now, with that being said, there's one more really interesting clip that I want to play to kind of tie all these things together, where N.T. Wright talks about power, he talks about money, he talks about the church. And I think this is a good way to end our discussion about N.T. Wright as it relates to his theory on economics. And man, this is a really interesting one. So let's give it a listen.
Let's say, no, actually, we live in a world where power and money and all sorts of kinds of power can be very, very destructive. How do we find our way into the dangerous jungle, not a garden, of the mid-21st century with climate change, with all the migration of peoples, etc.
Okay, I got to stop it there because, again, you can clearly see where N.T. Wright is playing his own kind of progressive hand. We have to talk about the problem of climate change. We have to talk about the problem of immigration. And of course, he's doing this from a left-wing perspective. So you got to take that for what it is. Again, I don't think that N.T. Wright's a very systematic thinker when it comes to the political and economic applications of his own theology. And that's a very good example of that. Let's continue listening.
How do we do that wisely, instead of imagining that we can create a utopia and then deal with one or two little blips within it? And I don't hear too many people addressing that question.
And so how does the Bible address that? How does the Bible address the ways in how you fight against power, sin, money?
It is to do with the founding and maintaining of genuine communities. And I had this phrase I used in a lecture, I can't remember how it goes now, something like mutually independent, worship-based, egalitarian, outward-facing, fictive kinship groups, and these are called churches. This is what the church should be. Sadly, the church usually misses out some of those. But ideally, the church as a multi-ethnic society, caring for one another, but constantly outward-facing and saying, we seem to be in this world, there are these needs over here, there are these people hurting here, what can we do as the people of God in Christ to address those needs? The church at its best has always done this. Now, both in the modern world, post-Enlightenment, and in the postmodern world, there's a huge amount of cynicism about the church, because people look at the church as a creaky old organization, and every time the church does something wrong with money or sex or power or whatever, the newspapers, certainly in my country, jump onto it. Oh, look at this, that's so much for the church. And that's partly because a lot of journalists either gave up Christianity when they were young or never got into it. But actually, I have seen the church being the church in real communities, and it's transformative. It really does make a difference, not just a difference. It can bring health and possibilities to communities. And this doesn't mean that they've all got to give up doing Facebook or whatever. It just means we need real communities, local. If it's real, it's local. And you can be as global as you like, but there have to be people that you actually relate to day by day, week by week. And if you don't have that, you shrink.
Yes.
And when you shrink, it hurts, and so you reach out for other unhealthy things.
I mean, there's really not much that he said there to disagree with. I completely agree. The church is the hope for the world. And one of the greatest aspects of N.T. Wright's work on Paul, as I said earlier in the episode, is his understanding of Pauline ecclesiology. It is the church and everybody else, and we are there for the world. We're supposed to be a witness to God. We're supposed to be a light, a blessing to the nations. And we do that by helping people in the need. And the church, when it is at its best, will foster strong local communities and take care of those who have genuine needs and during these very, very difficult periods in their lives. And I think that that is absolutely correct. I really, really, really believe that N.T. Wright could be consistent in terms of his own theology and economics and society if he just took the Austrian school into consideration. He has read thousands of books during the course of his life. He's an incredibly intelligent guy. I know that he would be able to grasp this. You just got to read some Ludwig von Mises, and it explains how all of these dynamics that you've rightly identified as being destructive of human society are actually caused by socialism and these big government programs. It's not Adam Smith's fault. It's not the reception of Adam Smith's fault. It has nothing to do with any of that, and everything to do with the fact that we have, especially as Christians, as a church, we have given up so much power to these centralized governments over the last 200 years that we now just expect that they are there to do the jobs that God has actually told us as Christians that we are supposed to do. And again, even though I don't subscribe to the anti-imperial reading of Paul, I do believe that the New Testament is very, very clear. All human empires will eventually be destroyed and judged by God, and our identity as citizens of an imperial power is completely relativized in the gospel. I am a member of the church, and that's all that really matters to me. And that identity is completely consistent with rejecting the state control of money, rejecting the state control of the economy, all of these things that have led to the problems that N.T. Wright correctly identifies. We have to reject them and just become the church. All of this is completely consistent with the economic philosophy of Ludwig von Mises. All right, guys. Well, that was a lot of fun. I don't know. I had to record half of this in the evening and the next half of it in the morning afterwards. So hopefully there's not a discrepancy in the way that my voice sounds about halfway through the episode. But it was a lot of fun to do this. It was a lot of fun going through the clips. And again, I'm glad that I could take on one of the world's most famous New Testament scholars in this episode. Again, no disrespect. N.T. Wright had a profound impact on my life. I still think that there are a lot of aspects of his work that are very, very valuable. I think that he is an absolutely historic figure in biblical studies and theology, and that people will be discussing his work for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, he's going to be in textbooks for the rest of Christian history, and I think that we need to give him the respect that he deserves, just like Michael Gorman, just like James K.A. Smith, just like all of these New Testament scholars that I talk to. I just wish that there was someone out there that would read a copy of Human Action and try to draw some conclusions about how our theology intersects with economics and politics in the modern world. I think that there might be one or two biblical scholars out there that are in a position to do that. They just need to do it. And if you happen to be one of those biblical scholars, I know that you might not make very much money. I'm a teacher, but my wife happens to have a nice job. I will personally purchase you a copy of any of Ludwig von Mises' books and send them to your door if you're a New Testament scholar or a theologian and you want to interact with his work. I promise that. I will pay for it myself, ship it right to your house. So, all right, guys. Anyways, I really appreciate you guys listening to the end of this episode that's way longer than I intended it to be. Like always, man, my these old school solo episodes, always, I envision them to be like 45 minutes long, and it always winds up being like 20 minutes longer than that. But I appreciate y'all hanging on to the end of this episode. Again, check me out over on YouTube at Pro Liberty Pod. I'm probably going to have a condensed version of this one. Obviously, I recorded all this on audio first because I had to do all the editing with the clips. And whenever I do solo episodes, I want to make sure that those are as well done as I can possibly make them. And so I won't have a video version of this entire episode, but I might have a little synopsis over there on YouTube for you to watch. And of course, please give me a 5-star rating and a review if you could. That would be really helpful. And follow me over on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. If you want to get on Twitter and make about 100 burner accounts and then all follow me, I don't really care how I get followers. It just helps me in the algorithms. I could really use that. As always, go over to libertarianchristians.com/shop. You can buy some sweet Protestant Libertarian podcast merch. Last night I was drinking whiskey out of my Protestant Libertarian podcast highball glass while I produced the first half of this episode, and this morning I am drinking coffee out of my Protestant Libertarian coffee mug as I produce the second half of this episode. You guys can get yourself some of those things over there, and hopefully by the time this episode airs, we'll have even more merch out there. Again, thank you guys for everything you've done. I love all of you, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle at ProLibertyPod. Again, that is at ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.